soldier's life is a study in brutal efficiency. Every piece of their gear, from the rifle they carry to the boots on their feet, is designed for one purpose: to keep them alive and effective. But what happens when the gear runs out? When the supply lines are cut, the foxhole is empty of rations, and the enemy is everywhere. This was the reality for countless soldiers in World War II. They found themselves isolated, hunted, and starving, forced to wage a second, silent war against their own bodies. In the thick jungles of Burma and the Pacific, food didn't just fuel them. It kept them from becoming casualties of disease and exhaustion. In the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front, a few mouthfuls of calories could prevent them from freezing to death. The canned rations, the chocolate bars, the hardtack biscuits, these were a luxury. In the moment of truth, the difference between living and dying came down to ingenuity and a primal willingness to consume anything that offered the slightest chance of survival. This isn't about the taste of a hot meal. It's about a cold, hard truth. Survival tastes like desperation. The conventional wisdom of the battlefield was useless when hunger set in. A soldier could be a marksman, a master of strategy, and a hero on the charge, but if his body began to fail, his training meant nothing. His hands would shake, his vision would blur, and his mind would cloud with a single, overriding thought: food. The military had tried to prepare for this. They issued K rations for short patrols and C rations for extended engagements. But the scale of a global war meant that men would be cut off for days, weeks, or even months. The Japanese soldier on a remote Pacific island, the American paratrooper behind enemy lines in Normandy, the German infantryman isolated in the brutal Russian winter. They all faced the same adversary, and they had to invent their own solutions. Their food was a macabre menu of last resorts. It was a testament to the raw human will to live, stripped of all comfort and pretense. They learned to see the world not through the lens of a battle map, but as a vast, unforgiving larder. Every field, every forest, every piece of discarded refuse became a potential meal. They weren't just fighting an enemy army. They were fighting the clock, a biological timer ticking down until their bodies gave out. These are the food hacks that kept them alive, not because they were delicious or nutritious in any traditional sense, but because they offered a temporary, often brutal, reprieve from the gnawing emptiness of starvation. Survival is about finding a way to eat when there is no food. This meant seeing the environment not as a landscape, but as an open-air pantry. For the men of World War II, this required a brutal shift in perspective. The first rule: anything that won't kill you is food. On the British commando raids in occupied Europe, secrecy was paramount. A campfire was a beacon to the enemy. So, soldiers developed a method to get a quick burst of energy without a flame. They would take their ration tea as a meal. The standard British tea ration wasn't just a bag of leaves. It was a dense, compressed block containing tea, sugar, and milk powder. Instead of boiling water to make a cup, a commando would break off a piece and chew it slowly. The sugar provided an immediate spike in blood glucose, and the milk powder a tiny, but crucial, bit of fat. It was a quick, silent, and effective way to fight off the onset of fatigue. In the vast, sprawling conflict on the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet soldiers faced a different kind of scarcity. Supply lines were long, and the land was often stripped bare by years of fighting. When desperation set in, soldiers on both sides turned to an unlikely source: insects and tree sap. A soldier with a small knife could tap certain trees like birch or maple, collecting the sweet, nutrient-rich sap. While it was mostly water, the natural sugars were a godsend, a small victory against the constant, draining hunger. In the forests, they learned to identify grubs and caterpillars. While a stomach-turning thought for most, these were high-calorie, high-protein sources of fuel. The soldiers would roast them on a hot stone or a bayonet to kill parasites and make them easier to chew. This wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, a brutal reality in a war of attrition. The Pacific Theater presented its own unique challenges. The jungle was unforgiving, and its resources were often hidden or poisonous. But a soldier of the American Merrill's Marauders, deep in Burma, learned a key lesson from local knowledge. His unit was often cut off from airdrops for days, and their rations were quickly depleted. Their solution: ration pack gum as a foraging guide. Inside every K ration was a stick of chewing gum. But this wasn't just a simple treat. The gum was made of chicle, a substance derived from the sap of the sapodilla tree. If a soldier could find that tree, they knew they had a source of food. They would tap the tree for its sap, which was edible and provided a small amount of energy. The fruit of the tree, similar to a potato, could also be roasted and eaten. The gum, a seemingly insignificant item, became a lifeline, a trail marker in the green hell of the jungle. These weren't skills taught in basic training. They were born of pure necessity, forged in the brutal crucible of combat. They were the secrets whispered from one exhausted, starving man to another, a brutal wisdom passed down on the battlefield, a catalog of unconventional and often disgusting meals that kept them moving forward, one painful step at a time. The first battle for survival was about finding calories. The second was about consuming them. A soldier might find a tin of meat or a sack of biscuits, a small treasure in a desolate landscape. But this was only half the war. The real challenge lay in the psychological and physical battle of making the unpalatable, the unappetizing, and the utterly monotonous a source of life. The rations designed for them were often utilitarian at best, and at worst, an insult to the senses. Their brutal ingenuity turned these meager supplies into something a starving body could accept. For the American GI, the staple of life was the C ration, a small, heavy can filled with a processed meat product. It was a caloric lifeboat, but a deeply unappealing one. Cold, congealed, and tasting vaguely of disappointment, the contents of the can were a notorious source of complaint. But in the foxholes of the European front, they developed a crucial hack: the C ration fry-up. A soldier would take the can, cut it open, and, using a bayonet or a mess kit spoon, would scoop out the greasy contents. He would then build a small, smokeless fire from scavenged twigs and paper, placing the meat in his mess kit. The goal wasn't to cook it, but to warm it. The grease would render down, creating a sizzling base. He would then crumble in the hard biscuits from his ration, rock-hard, flour and water discs that could break a tooth. As the biscuits absorbed the molten fat, the mixture would begin to resemble a rudimentary hash. It was a minor miracle of culinary desperation. The warmth and aroma transformed the cold, fatty sludge into a hot, filling meal that tricked the mind into a momentary sense of normalcy and gave the body a much-needed injection of calories. It was a tiny act of defiance against the dehumanizing conditions of war, a way of asserting some control over their miserable existence. The British soldier, too, had his own version of this grim art. He relied on bully beef, or king corned beef, and rock-solid biscuits. In the blistering heat of the North African campaign, where every calorie was a luxury and spoilage a constant threat, he learned to make biscuits and bull. The corned beef was a greasy, preserved meat designed to last forever, but to be a chore to eat. The biscuits were so hard they could be used as building material. The soldier would take his tin of beef and mash it with a fork or his fingers, then crumble the biscuits into the meat. The grease from the beef would soften the biscuits, and the soldier would work it into a dense, solid paste. The resulting patty could be eaten raw, or if a fire could be risked, fried in its own fat. This mixture was a masterpiece of endurance. It was calorie-dense, portable, and, most importantly, it was less likely to spoil in the harsh desert sun than the original canned meat. It was the food equivalent of a soldier's iron will, uncompromising, tough, and perfectly suited for a world that demanded nothing less. In the vast, barren expanse of the Russian front, German soldiers faced a different and even more brutal challenge. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and as the bitter winter set in, they were forced to forage in a land that was already starving. They were reduced to eating the German turnip diet. Turnips were a hardy root vegetable, a staple crop of the region that could survive the freezing temperatures. Soldiers would pull them from the frozen ground, and that was often their only meal for days. There were no fry-ups, no clever concoctions. They would simply eat them raw, chewing the fibrous, bitter vegetable, or if they were lucky enough to find small fire, they would boil them into a bland, colorless mash. This diet was not only nutritionally deficient, but psychologically devastating. It was a constant reminder of their isolation and the failure of their supply lines. It was the taste of defeat, and it wore them down, bit by bit, as surely as a relentless enemy. When the enemy wasn't just hunger, but also time, and all conventional rations were gone, soldiers turned to something even more fundamental. They learned to make a meal out of things that were never meant to be food. In the deepest desperation, they would boil the bones of any animal they found, scavenging for marrow. They would even boil their own leather belts and gear. The purpose was not to eat the leather, but to soften it, hoping to chew it enough to extract any tiny bit of fat or gelatin. It was a last, desperate attempt to give the body some caloric fuel, to trick the mind with the act of eating, and to buy a few more hours of life. This was the ultimate improvisation, a final, brutal testament to the fact that when a soldier's stomach is empty, there is no line that cannot be crossed in the name of survival. When a soldier has eaten everything, the bitter roots, the roasted insects, the last crumb of a fried biscuit, they are faced with the ultimate test. This is not about sustenance anymore. It is about a final, desperate act of will, a fight against the very body that is failing them. These are the last resorts, the brutal, final food hacks that mark the line between a living man and a corpse. One of the most famous and, in a way, most cruel of these hacks was the forced consumption of the deer ration bar. This was a block of chocolate, but it was designed to be as unappetizing as possible. It was made with a blend of chocolate, sugar, cocoa butter, and oat flour, but it was fortified with vitamins and intentionally made bitter and waxy. Its purpose was not to be a treat, but a last-ditch emergency food. The army's order was clear. A soldier was only to eat it in an absolute emergency, and never more than one a day. The hope was that the taste would deter the soldier from eating it like a candy bar. But for a starving soldier, the cruel taste was a moot point. In the cold and the hunger, they would gnaw on the hard block, often for days on end, consuming nothing but this dense, chalky bar. The high sugar content and lack of other nutrients would lead to severe digestive issues. But for a man on the brink of collapse, a day of discomfort was a small price to pay for a few more hours of energy. It was a food that was designed to be a lifesaver, and in its very design, it perfectly embodied the brutal, no-frills logic of war. When even a deer ration was gone, the fight continued with what little a soldier had. Many resorted to the tobacco or caffeine cure. Cigarettes were often a part of a soldier's ration, and when hunger was at its peak, the nicotine could be used as an appetite suppressant. Soldiers would chew the dry tobacco, the acrid taste and chemical kick temporarily overriding the gnawing hunger. Similarly, they would take the powdered instant coffee from their ration pack, meant for a cup of hot water that wasn't available, and eat it dry by the spoonful. The massive dose of caffeine would give them a jittery, nervous energy, a false sense of alertness that could keep them moving when their bodies were screaming for sleep and food. This wasn't a nutritional hack. It was a psychological one, a way of tricking the body into believing it wasn't starved, just a little wired. It was a desperate gamble, as the crash that inevitably followed would be even more severe. And then there was the most brutal, the most desperate of all. The moment a soldier was so starved that his mind turned to his own gear. The leather of a boot, the canvas of a pack, the fabric of a uniform. They would chew on it, hoping for some minute caloric gain. The act itself was a brutal one. A soldier would boil a piece of leather from his belt or shoe, a long, tedious process that only softened it enough to chew. The body would absorb almost nothing but the act of chewing and swallowing something. Anything was a small psychological victory against a foe that was winning. In the frozen chaos of the Russian winter, some German soldiers were found with their boots chewed almost to pieces, a grim testament to the final, silent battle they had lost. Finally, there was the ultimate gamble, eating the enemy's rations. It was a well-known risk. The enemy's rations could be poisoned, tampered with, or simply spoiled. But for a soldier on the edge of starvation, this was a risk worth taking. Account from the front lines in every theater of war recount starving soldiers scavenging through abandoned enemy camps, taking any tin, any sack of food they could find. A German soldier in France might find a tin of American Spam and eat it without a second thought, just as an American soldier in the Pacific might find and consume a Japanese rice ball. There was no loyalty in starvation, only an overriding need to survive. These are not choices, but compulsions. They were a testament to the raw, visceral reality of war. The story of a soldier's survival is not just written in the history books of grand battles and heroic charges. It is also written in the dark corners of the battlefield, in the secret, desperate acts of a man trying to find one more day's worth of calories. These are the brutal food hacks that remind us that the human will to live is the most powerful force on any battlefield.